In this video, we're going to be looking at the Back to Eden gardening method through the lens of the Soils in Sync infographic and soil health principles. Paul Gautschi's garden has inspired many, but many have failed to reproduce his success. Paul utilizes a huge amount of wood chips in his garden. We'll look at how he's using them and why it's not working for you. I guess I should also address this image because according to the whole Soils in Sync shtick, this should be impossible. All that and more in this episode of Soils in Sync. Westone here with Soils in Sync. Check out the full intro to the Soils in Sync infographic and soil health principles in the video I have linked in the description. Tickle that like button, subscribe, heck it's free, and let us know your experience in the comments because we're all here just trying to learn together. Enjoy this tour. Paul's garden is located just outside of Seattle, somewhere in this region here. His bioregion is in the Pacific Northwest coastal forest. Seattle also receives about 40 inches of rainfall per year, so let's not overlook that significant detail in the success of Paul Gautschi's garden. And the weather there is very much moderated by the ocean, very stable, very rainy. Right now we're sitting at the end of March and we got temperatures in the 50s and pretty much rainfall all week. The Back to Eden gardening documentary attracted a lot of attention to Paul a few years back, and everyone rushed out to copy him. Rightfully so, as his garden is extremely impressive. Go check that video out for sure. This is what I'm going to be following in this video. I'm also going to be using some of the images from this blog, The Grovestead. So go check out their article on their visit to Gautschi's gardens as well. So Paul attributes wood chips as a cornerstone of his success. Although many viewers have taken away from this documentary that wood chips are the miracle cure for their garden, a closer look reveals more nuance. You can see in this image here, he's got all these wood chips around a lot of these orchard trees, more wood chips around these orchard trees. More wood chips around the orchard trees. Okay, mixed arborist wood chips are ideal for feeding your orchard trees as a mulch. And in this image here, you don't quite see as many wood chips in his actual garden. And you can see in the background here where the wood chips seem to start closer to the trees. Another look here in his Back to Eden documentary. It looks less woody here under his vegetable crops as it does in the background under his trees, so it is possible that that is intentional. And of course that would be my recommendation would be to do that, is to mulch your trees with your wood chips. And if you're going to use wood chips on any of your vegetable crops, they're going to need to be combined with some high nitrogen source like urine or manure, something along those lines. At this point in the video, he shows that he does have a chicken coop. He uses wood chip bedding in here to capture that chicken poop. He puts all of his green vegetable waste and scraps here to feed the chickens. This is a high nitrogen leafy green. The waste from that will get absorbed into the bedding. This is a critical piece that a lot of people are overlooking. This bedding that the chickens, you see how they turn it, they break it down, they poop in it. This creates a really, really nice compost that then he uses to dress his beds before planting. And in this scene here, he's taken his screened chicken poop bedding and dumping it over his bed. So notice this is not pure wood chips. There's still a little bit of woody chunks in there that didn't quite fully break down. And this is what you should be using on your vegetable crops. Now, I personally probably wouldn't use this chicken manure compost on the fruit trees, because again, fruit trees don't necessarily need all that high nitrogen, high nitrate stuff. Some of it probably wouldn't hurt, but trees are going to do better with just the pure wood chips. And here we see him just spreading that out, maybe about an inch or two over his bed. At this point in the documentary, he's at a different section of his garden where he's growing potatoes, and he says specifically that this soil is horse manure and wood shavings. So if I'm to take him literally, that means it's wood shavings plus horse manure. You combine those and compost those, you get something that your vegetable crops like, something because horse manure is maybe a little bit less nitrogen rich than poultry manure, your Solanaceae potato crop doesn't need quite as much nitrogen. And you can kind of see that this soil looks to be more of like almost a peat moss consistency. Real loose, real aerobic, really easy for those potatoes to spread out in. At another point in the documentary, he's buying finished compost from a compost producer. I tried to figure out what was in this. I wasn't entirely sure. And here he's applying that same compost to his garden beds, similar to the way he did with his chicken manure. But again, those wood chips and wood shavings are not the only ingredient in that compost. Key point. Okay, so I think we've covered the wood chip thing. One other thing that's fairly astonishing about Paul's garden is that it seems to grow just about everything very well. Just trying to look at what he's growing in this image here, a little bit hard to tell. I'm going to assume this is like spinach, beets, cabbage, some kind of brassica, and this back here looks like carrots. He's even looks like he's got some kale back here under the apple trees, which brings me to this conundrum here. Why is this a conundrum? Why is growing brassicas under an apple tree supposed to be impossible? Well, brassicas and orchard trees are on opposite sides of the spectrum. So the pickle is that brassicas like a very high nitrogen environment, and generally in the presence of wood chips, that nitrogen gets tied up to the point where it's no longer available for the brassicas until the compost has fully broken down. On the other hand, orchard trees really thrive on that dead woody material. So for them to both be growing in the same place seems like a bit of a conundrum. But what I'm going to have to assume is that he used that compost, that finished chicken manure compost, and spread it around this area where he's growing these. Because if this were literally just pure wood chips, I know for a fact these brassicas would not be doing this well. On the other hand, if he's putting finished garden compost underneath this tree, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to hurt the tree. That nitrogen may just be better utilized elsewhere because the tree doesn't necessarily need it in the same way that some of these brassicas do. If I go back to this slide from my explainer video, we see this study here. They tested the biomass growth of trees with various types of mulches and fertilizers. And the conclusion was that wood chips by far produce the greatest biomass growth in that tree. Finished compost was the second best option. That's this bar here, as compared to putting nothing on those trees, which was over here. So finished compost did do those trees well, for sure. But if you had the choice, wood chips were the best by far. So my point is that finished compost could be better utilized on the vegetable beds rather than being put on the trees. Most of us have very limited resources. The infographic can help us prioritize those limited resources. For instance, if I can't get the sheer quantity of wood chips that Paul Gautschi can get, I might use those limited resources specifically for my orchard trees or my blueberries. If I have a limited amount of grass clippings or nitrogen, I might save that nitrogen for some of my more nitrogen-loving crops like my rhubarb, my spinach, my brassicas type of thing. Let me try to make this very simple. If you have no organic matter in your soil, you don't have a carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you have a little bit of organic matter, you still might have a balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio. But if you're trying to grow a heavy feeder that requires a lot of nitrates or nitrogen, the requirements might exceed the amount of nitrogen available in your soil. So your plants are going to be limited by what's on its dinner plate, so to speak. Paul Gautschi's garden, on the other hand, has very, very high organic matter. And as we've seen, when he's trying to grow some of his veggie crops, he uses his poultry manure-based compost to give this side of the scale a little bit more of a boost. We also noticed that his orchard trees had a little bit more of a woody mulch underneath them, giving this side of the spectrum the boost. And one thing that people take away, I think, incorrectly from this particular Back to Eden documentary is that they think wood chips are the holy grail. And so their soil has no organic matter in it, and then they just dump on a whole bunch of wood chips, And now you've created a pretty big imbalance where none of this stuff really has enough nitrogen to grow. So in other cases, people add too much manure, for example, and they don't have enough carbon. And that promotes this weedy stuff over here, or it might burn up all of the carbon organic matter in the soil, and then your soil becomes hard. So the remedy to that would be to add more carbon. Carbon sources like wood chips are a bulking agent. It's a nice porous substrate for those roots to be able to grow in an aerobic environment. But you do need to add nitrogen, though. They do need a small source of nitrogen. And nitrogen is easy to tell if it's deficient because the plants will be kind of stunted and yellowish, kind of like you see here. At the 31-minute mark, he's pointing out the fact that up front, hauling in this much organic matter is a lot of work, and that is very much true. Most agricultural soils, most home gardens are starving for organic matter. There's a period of time up front that's like the build-up phase. Like you're going to have to do a lot of work up front because you're feeding a deficit. But he's saying that as organic matter accumulates, the benefits are compounding and things become easier and easier. It is a virtuous cycle. Then he talks about pH for a minute, and his soil pH is, somewhere 6 or 6.5. I personally don't pay too much attention to soil pH or various other scientific soil tests, nor the NPK chemical philosophy. Soil pH, I think, is overemphasized. Paul makes the same point. He says, I never test my soil, but when somebody does come and test it out of curiosity, he said everything looks really good. So instead of NPK and pH and all this stuff, focus on the soil health principles, increasing soil organic matter, and then keeping that organic matter in carbon and nitrogen balance according to what your crop prefers. At this point in the video, we've got some other people trying to replicate Paul Gautschi's model, and what they're doing here is laying down newspaper right on top of the grass and then piling up wood chips. And they quickly discover, after they get this garden built and planted, that their roots are not able to get down into the soil. They're pretty much just growing in the wood chips, and because they don't add any nitrogen, they quickly discover that they need nitrogen. And they do supplement with nitrogen in the form of blood meal. They build a second garden later on in the documentary, and this time they actually do add some finished compost underneath the wood chips and a thin layer of manure. So they do get it right the second time after having learned that pure wood chips ain't going to cut it. And this is how they layered the second garden. Newspaper first, finished compost, wood chips, and then manure as a thin layer on top. So manure is one of those things where like you add it once a year or you add it in a very thin layer. The distribution of manure in nature is very thin, even in like herding ruminants. I mean, they might drop a bunch of it down all at once and then not come back for months. You definitely don't want to overdo manure, and it's very easy to do, and I see it a lot. And excess manure is one of the leading causes of excess weeds. A quick look through the lens of soil health principles. He's always got mulch. He's always got living plants in the ground. You can see the wood chips here providing a sort of sunblock, keeping those microbes cool and happy. At this point in the video, he's talking about using whatever organic matter you have. And I agree, that's all you can do is use whatever you have. But it does need to be in balance. I was just talking to a lady the other day about gardening, and she has horses, and so she says she uses a lot of horse manure on her garden. So I started asking her, does it grow a lot of weeds? Does it grow a lot of grass? Is your soil really hard? Yes, yes, and yes were her answers. Yeah, use what you have, but if all you have is manure, your bottleneck is carbon. In my case, my bottleneck is nitrogen. I can get all the tree leaves and wood chips I need, but I don't get enough nitrogen. So use what you have. That might dictate that you might have to grow certain plants that thrive in what you have. Here's some footage I found of my grandpa's garden. And this, I imagine, is pretty similar to what the lady I was talking to, what her garden looks like. And compare this to Paul Gautschi's model. My grandpa's garden was getting worse every single year. Paul Gautschi's garden is getting better every single year. At the 21-minute mark, they make a very good point in saying when you're putting a mulch on the soil, just put it on top. Don't till it in. So what this guy did was he tilled his wood chips in. The only place that's going to be nitrogen deficient is where the soil is making contact with the wood chip. A few other points about keeping soil covered. So I definitely don't want to be the fool who criticizes Paul Gautschi, but one suggestion I might make would be to create beds and pathways. Separate your walkways from your garden beds. This keeps your beds looser and airier, and then all your trotting happens on maybe like a wood chip pathway. The other thing that would do is it would bring these rows closer together. You could have, say, 3 crops or 2 crops in a bed, which would bring those crops closer together and keep the soil covered a bit more densely, because there is some wasted, like the sunlight is hitting between these rows of plants and more or less being wasted and cooking the soil surface. Now, he lives in a very wet environment, probably not an issue for him. He does have some physical disabilities that keep him from getting around real well. Perhaps that's a reason why he's not doing what I'm suggesting. But his soils are obviously covered with mulch in some of these other places with the wood chips. But where the veggie crops are, there could be a bit more soil cover. Next soil health principle, minimize soil disturbance. Paul does not use a tiller. Paul only is ever seen with his rake.
I mean, there's no tilling, there's no digging, this is it. This is the only tool I need. There's no tilling, there's no tilling, there's no tilling. This is the only tool I need. Only tool I need. This is the only tool I need.
Increasing diversity, well, it sounds like he's pretty much using any and all organic matter that he can get a hold of, from wood chips to chicken manure to horse manure to straw. He's always reusing his prunings and clippings, so there's a certain amount of diversity built into that. Paul's garden is a phenomenal example of what can be achieved using natural materials, but using the Soils in Sync infographic can help you to use those natural materials in just the right place so that our soils are in sync with our crop's preference. And the final soil health principle, knowing your context. This is about knowing what resources you have available to you and how that can help you find the path of least resistance. We can't all necessarily manage our gardens the same way Paul does, because he has a different set of resources than we have. In summary, Paul gets a lot of rain. Paul gets a lot of compost. Paul has a ton of wood chips. Those wood chips are best utilized underneath the orchard trees. Wood chips combined with manure are best utilized on the vegetable garden. If this video helped grow your soils, you can help grow the channel by liking, subscribing, and commenting. If not, add a dislike, but at least tell me why. I'm still getting the kinks worked out.
Westone here, helping you keep those soils in sync.